Our event today, as I mentioned, is focused on the uprisings in the Arab world. I'm going to introduce our panelists in the order in which they will present, and then I will turn it over to them. Michele, Dunne, seated in the middle, was a former specialist at the State Department and White House on Middle East affairs, and she served in assignments including the National Security Council staff, the Secretary of State's policy planning staff, and the U.S. Embassy in Cairo. She holds a PhD in Arabic language and literature from Georgetown University, where she's an adjunct professor of Arab studies. She's currently a researcher at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Seated immediately to my left is Nadia Hijab, the co-director of Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network, and a frequent public speaker and media commentator. She also serves as a senior fellow at the Institute for Palestine Studies. She's co-authored Citizens Apart, a portrait of Palestinians in Israel, and she's the editor-in-chief was the editor-in-chief of the London-based Middle East magazine before joining the United Nations, where she established her own consulting business. And of course, a man who probably certainly needs no introduction, Ambassador Clovis Maksoud, who's a professor of international law and organization and the director of the Center for the Global South at American University in Washington, D.C. He was the chief representative of the League of Arab States in India from 1961 to 1966, and was appointed as the chief representative of the Arab League to the United States and the United Nations in September of 1979. So it's great to have his perspective here. I just wanted to mention that some of you may recall Ambassador Maksoud spoke at our annual conference last year in October, only a few months before the events began in Tunisia and then Egypt and now throughout the Arab world. And he began his comments then by saying that he is the living dinosaur of the Arab world, and that he wanted to disclose his deficits before he spoke about his assets. He is, he said, irreconcilably an Arab nationalist, and he doesn't think that there is a delivery of Palestinian rights except through a moment of Arab renaissance and unity. So this is, again, just a few months before the events we're seeing today. So I'm glad to welcome all of our panelists to hear their perspectives on the events that are sweeping the region. I'll turn it over at this point to Michele.
Thank you, Yusuf, and thank you to the Palestine Center for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm going to say a few very quick words about the events in the region, and then Yusuf asked me to comment particularly on what this means for the United States, for U.S. policy in the region. I think it was Fareed Zakaria whose commentary I read earlier today describing these uprisings as a seismic shift in the region, and I think he's right about that. Certainly I think we're facing an entirely new chapter in the Middle East. The effects of these uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt so far, Libya ongoing, and we'll see where else it goes, are going to continue to spread for several years at least. And I think if some of these countries make successful transitions to democracy, Tunisia, Egypt, Iraq, which is still in a transition process, then the effects are going to last even much longer than that, much more than a few years. Because I think that the grievances that motivated these uprisings and the phenomena that set them off are quite widely shared. We're all aware of the demographic youth bulge in the region, something that many people had been watching for a long time and wondering what kind of an effect it would have. And unfortunately, the unemployment and underemployment that accompanied that youth bulge and the sense of disenfranchisement. At the same time, I think it's undeniable that the changing information environment, the fact that this young generation that was coming up had access to so much more information, so many different points of view, from within their own country as well as from other countries, and had the ability to be in touch via new media with many, many others, and to exchange viewpoints in a way that the generations before them could not do. I also think that there's been an increasing focus over the last decade or so on domestic affairs inside of Arab countries as opposed to foreign affairs. Now, that's not to say that people in Arab countries don't care anymore about events outside their own countries. Certainly they do, about the Palestine issue, about Iraq, about many other things that have gone on. But definitely there has been an intensified focus on what is going on inside their own countries. And then there's something that happened in the last few years, which is a sense that developed that their governments were perhaps vulnerable, were not to be feared quite as much as they were in the past. Now, I could go on and on about all these things, which are very interesting to me, but I don't want to take a lot of time. We can certainly discuss them more if you want to. I think, though, the case of Libya also is pointing out quite painfully the significant differences. I don't want to overplay these common issues among Arab countries, because I think the very frightening scenes we see playing out in Libya now point out the difference between countries where there are strong institutions and countries where there are not. In Tunisia and Egypt, there was a cohesive military that was able at some point to make a choice between restoring stability to the country and maintaining loyalty to a particular leader. Unfortunately, in Libya, I think there is not, and there is not by Gaddafi's design, that kind of a cohesive military. And so we see this kind of fragmentation and use of violence, use of a much higher level of violence against the population than we saw in Tunisia and Egypt. Although, let's not forget, quite a few people died in Tunisia and Egypt as well. So the implications, I think, for the United States and for U.S. policies in this region are enormous. U.S. policy priorities, have been completely upset by this development. The Obama administration came into office 2 years ago planning to work on Israeli-Palestinian peace, planning to engage with Iran to try to prevent the emergence of Iran as a nuclear power. And frankly, it had no interest in what it saw as the failed freedom agenda of George Bush. Now what we see is that these demands for change in the region, for democratic governance in the region, have forced themselves onto Obama's agenda, and that he has chosen, I think wisely, to get on the right side of this and to be in favor now of the spread of democracy and human rights in the region. But I do think the administration is playing catch-up. They're trying very much now to show they were on top of these issues all along, and they were in favor of these things all along. But to be honest, there wasn't much attention and much priority given to these issues, to what was happening inside Arab countries and change that might be coming from inside Arab countries. There was not much attention given to that at all over the last couple of years. Now, the two other issues that Obama wanted to work on, of course, are still there and are not going to go away. The Palestinian situation, the Israeli-Palestinian situation, I think is unsustainable. I know that Nadia is going to talk more about that, so I'm not going to say much about it. But I do think that the Obama administration doesn't know where to go with that issue right now. We've seen several chapters of, frankly, failed efforts on the Palestine issue, and I'm not sure they have a clear plan where to go with it now. Also, unfortunately, you know, they are dealing with an Israeli government that has already shown really no interest, I think, in reaching an agreement with the Palestinians, and now seems to be looking at regional events as a reason to do less rather than more about that. So anyway, well, I'm sure Nadia will have much more to say about that. Regarding Iran, I think we have bought some time with the effective sanctions and Stuxnet and so forth, but the issue will be back. And I don't agree, by the way, necessarily with the assessment that these changes that we see going on in the region, in Egypt and so forth, are going to tilt the regional balance in the favor of Iran. I think the United States needs to do what it can going forward to encourage successful transitions to democracy in Egypt, Tunisia, as well as continuing to do that in Iraq. And let's hope that there will be that opportunity in Libya as well. And in dealings with the other countries, the United States is going to have to start raising much more seriously the kind of significant reforms that there might still be time in other Arab countries for leaders to take significant sort of top-down gradual reforms rather than the kind of bottom-up, much less predictable change that we're seeing happening in countries. I think some leaders might be capable of doing that. Others clearly are not. I mean, I think in Libya, for example, there's no, you know, there's no, and there never was a chance for real reform by the Gaddafi government. If we don't do our best to help successful transitions in these countries where change is already underway, I think the alternatives are quite dire. I also think the United States will have to learn new ways of working with democratic governments in these countries, and will need to grow a thicker skin as these governments are going to be more responsive to their public opinion when it comes to the kind of foreign policies they're going to have, the kind of relations they're going to have with the United States, and so forth. It's the model that the United States has pursued, which I've always thought of a kind of a 19th century model of personalized diplomacy, you know, with an individual leader or a very small group. It's just not sustainable. It's really anachronistic. It's not even the way we do diplomacy in most of the rest of the world. And it's going to go out of fashion in the Arab world as well. I'm not saying any of this will be easy, but I do believe it can be done. I think the United States can have good relations with democratic countries in the Middle East that will be, although they will have their ups and downs, and those governments will make decisions that we don't like or elect people that we don't feel comfortable with. I think these can be ultimately more mature and sustainable relationships.
Thank you very much, Michele. Please go ahead, Nadia.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Yusuf, and it's a real pleasure to be here back at the Palestine Center. It's been too long away. So yes, as Michele was saying, I think these days are filled with all of us, for all of us with excitement, apprehension, energy, hope, and fear, and also with irony. I couldn't help thinking how, since 1968, when the Palestinian Revolution imposed itself on the Arab scene, there was hope in the Arab world that maybe the Palestinian Revolution would lead to revolution throughout the Arab world. That didn't happen. On the contrary, the Arab regimes consolidated their power, and the PLO and the Palestinians, the Palestinian Revolution, faced repeated crushing military blows, including, as you know, in Jordan, 70-71, in Lebanon in 82-83, and in the occupied territories many times, most recently the 2002 horrific Israeli invasion and the War of the Cities, and in Gaza in 2008, 2009. And so while many today are asking if the Palestinian Revolution is even still alive, it's really fascinating to see the Arab world being swept by non-military revolutionary movements civilian uprisings which are using both new and old techniques and bringing together all ages and all religions, many of these techniques and approaches were in fact previously used by Palestinians, for example, in the first Intifada from 87 to 93. So I guess the irony is, and the question for us today is, can the Arab revolutions resuscitate the Palestinian revolution? I think perhaps the first and most immediate impact of the Egyptian-Tunisian uprisings, followed as they were by what's going on in Yemen, Bahrain, and Libya, as well as Iraq, has been to underscore for, beyond shadow of a doubt, that the Arab peoples are willing to stand their ground and face death and injury to demand their rights, their basic human rights, including but not only the right to free and fair elections, so that their governments can truly represent them and be accountable to them, to the electorate, and so that state budgets, we always talk about elections, but we forget about the budget. State budgets are corruption-free and provide free, fair, and meaningful opportunities. So the remaining Arab regimes, the ones that aren't facing these uprisings, are trying to head off the process either by providing more money to people and in other ways. Similarly, the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah has had to move from ordering its security forces to crack down on demonstrations in support of Tunisian and Egyptian revolutions, and to try and get closer to the people it claims to represent. And furthermore, it's trying very hard, the PA, to reclaim democratic credentials and to revive mandates that have long since expired. As you know, the PA quickly announced a cabinet reshuffle, followed also very quickly by announcements for municipal as well as legislative and presidential elections before September. And as you know, in those protests that the Palestinians were able to hold in the occupied territories, once the PA loosened up, the people demanded an end to the split between Fatah and Hamas in Gaza and the West Bank. So we have now another response from the Palestinian Authority, partly in response to popular feeling that hates this split, but also to the disappearance from the equation of the Mubarak-led policy on Palestine and the loss of a major backer of Mahmoud Abbas and the PA. We see the PA now making gestures towards Hamas. So we've seen a shift, a very quick shift from a unilateral announcement of elections, which Hamas immediately rejected in the absence of national unity, to invitations from the Ramallah-based Prime Minister Salam Fayyad to Hamas to join the government. Equally importantly, Fayyad said Hamas could stay on in the Gaza Strip and keep up its security control. And I think perhaps the most important thing he said, so long as Hamas maintained the calm, in other words, the ceasefire with Israel, then nothing else mattered. Everything else could be worked out. So as time goes on, we may look back at this statement of Fayyad's as the beginning of the end of the three conditions of the quartet to have Hamas join in the political process. So suddenly the Palestinians are behaving in response to their own demands and needs, and not in response to external imposed agendas. The Arab revolutions have also impacted on the PA's relationship with its main backer, the United States. We saw the PA stand and the PLO stand their ground on the resolution condemning settlements. They refused to back down as requested in a 50-minute, with the previously the US had used both carrots and sticks to try and get the PA to withdraw the resolution so that they wouldn't have to veto. But despite a 50-minute phone call from Barack Obama to Mahmoud Abbas, they refused to do so. That would have been unthinkable once. Of course, the PA's position was already weakened because of its the stand it took towards the Goldstone report, but had already made it vulnerable. And in the wake of the Arab revolutions, it simply could not say yes to Barack Obama. And it's really interesting to see some elements of the Fatah party kind of upping the ante in the PA's relationship with the United States, and kind of a replay of the mouse that roared. You have the PA officials in East Jerusalem now breaking off contacts with the US consulate in Jerusalem and refusing to accept any aid from the US. So rather than the US boycotting the PA or the Palestinian Authority, the reverse is beginning to happen. And the Jerusalemites are urging other Palestinians to do so. Now, should we see these moves, should we understand these moves as a shift to self-reliance and a move to reclaim the leadership of the Palestinian struggle, or simply as a way to buy time and to stay in power by the regime? And I really want to say regimes because we have two, one in the West Bank and one in Gaza. Certainly some of the PA moves are gimmicky, shows of democracy rather than the real thing. You have Fayyad going on Facebook and inviting any Palestinian who likes to suggest people, ministers for his cabinet. And so that's, I think, to my mind, is a bit gimmicky. What's certain is that the PA moves do not really address the very serious challenges that face the Palestinians. Israeli attacks on Gaza are continuing every day. Arrests of West Bankers, including children, are continuing every day. The intensive colonization of East Jerusalem, nothing stopping that. The expulsion of Palestinians, Bedouins, and others from their homes and lands in the West Bank, as well as, by the way, in Israel itself, where the civil liberties of the Palestinian citizens of Israel remain under threat. None of that is challenged by these actions of the PA. And as Michele pointed out, you know, there's been a focus on the domestic affairs of different Arab countries. Similarly, this attempt to put the Palestinian house in order by the PA by bringing Hamas and Fatah back together again, while welcome, is only scratching the surface of putting the Palestinian house in order. And I think the Palestinians' most pressing demands and needs were very well expressed by the General Union of Palestinian Students at the end of January in a statement in which they launched the beginning of a campaign for direct elections to the Palestinian National Council. For the reason being to find a way to restore the Palestine Liberation Organization as the sole legitimate representatives of the Palestinian people, wherever they may be. The student union statement, I think, goes to the heart, straight to the heart of the way Palestinian governance has been completely skewed towards, and they push the drive to get statehood almost at any price, and completely away from the movement for liberation and self-determination for the Palestinian people. So the PA has been beefed up at the expense of the PLO, which has been allowed to shrivel. And we have to look at the student union's statement in that light and give it some importance, because the student union is an integral member of the PLO and has nurtured many of the Palestinian leaders. And they all started as leaders in the General Union of Palestinian Students, including Arafat and others. So it has some potential to begin or to join a movement for change on the ground. So just a couple of words on looking to the future. There are some trends that will help the PA regime maintain its position, including the fact that the West and the Western media remain very vested in the what I call the Fayyadist dream of institution building under occupation and trying to get a state, as well as there's growing support to the UN, to the PA plan to seek UN recognition of statehood in September. Another key factor supporting allowing the PA to stay on could be a Hamas willingness to strike a deal. So it too can stay in power. So both Fatah and Hamas would strike a deal, and other Palestinian factions would join them or not as they want. So all of this could perpetuate the PA regime in the West Bank and Gaza, but none of it will help to shake really Israel's control of the territories. On the other hand, there may be a real Palestinian revolution against the regime or regimes claiming representation, starting from the grassroots like the students, and perhaps spreading to other unions and as well as a Palestinian community in exiles to revive the PLO so that Palestinians have really authentic representation of their aspirations for freedom and self-determination. And for the Palestinians, just as much as for their Arab sisters and brothers, the outcome will depend on the extent that they are able to stay the course and impose their will. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nadia. Ambassador Maksoud.
These two introductions really point the way for me to say, one, that we are at this moment of history at the Palestine Center, and Palestine remains central. And in that sense, I will now try to disabuse some people about the thrust of these revolutionary movements that have taken place now and are in the planning, perhaps, in the rest of the Arab nation. You will excuse me that I will mention the term Arab nation, although that still doesn't sink in, but the fact that the interrelationships that have developed among these movements with similar objectives meant that the Arab world was a wealthy nation of poor people. So how do we structure, or how do we understand the dynamics of these revolutionary developments? I say revolutionary developments because they have not fulfilled the revolution itself. They constituted a breakthrough, an empowering political atmosphere, a removal of those who obstructed the path of evolution. And revolution in this context cannot be perpetual. Revolution is the blockage to the normalcy of evolutionary process. When the evolutionary process is arrested, and the results of being arrested is denial of human rights, human needs, through the power of governance, reckless sometimes, ruthless most of the times, then revolution becomes the instrument of restoring historical evolution to its normal course. If we understand this to mean what took place in the Arab world, then we can come to grips with an easier understanding about why the United States in particular have always identified stability with immobility, with political immobility. Now, as Professor Dunne has explained, there is perhaps a reassessment taking place. Stability in a poor nation with rich people is provocative. And with the communication revolution, it speeds up the awareness and the consciousness. And what is taking place throughout the Arab world is a transcendence to a very large extent of the diverse components of what constitutes an Arab. And because the Arab has been traditionally translated or interpreted as sort of an ethnic, basically perhaps religious, etc. These movements, especially of the young, of the trade unions in Tunis, of women, have transcended pluralism in defining the various categories of components of the Arab people into diversity, celebrating diversity and rejecting the split of what constitutes pluralism. That is where the term Arab becomes more relevant, because it is becoming now identified with diversity and with the notion of equal citizenship. This is why Lebanon still remains a healthy civil society and the most reactionary system of governance. 5 for the Christians, 3 for the Orthodox, 10 for the Shiites, etc. That remains, that Lebanon is in complete sympathy with what is taking place on the level of civil society and genuinely worried about its pluralistic system becoming a system of diversity. Diversity in the sense that you don't eliminate particularism, but you bring it into a salad bowl of a population. Now this is one thing. The second, there is, as I read today in the papers and the fears yesterday expressed by Mr. Netanyahu and all that, about the Iranian model. Iran is now becoming the most important regional power. Well, let me also try to deconstruct this growing realistic assessment, which is not realistic, I'll put it in quotation marks. What is more relevant, if you want to have a paradigm in the region, what is more relevant for this Arab national upheaval, uprising, is the, if there is to be a model, is Turkey, not Iran. Iran might have been an attraction when it overthrew the Shah of Iran and promised. But Turkey has evolved in a more peaceful way, where secularism was an alternative to Islam. The blending process is starting. And that is why when the fears, the anxieties of Israel and some of the basic neoconservatives in this country, what about everything they couldn't understand? The youth came and empowered. They attracted the most educated students and teachers in Egypt. All they can think of. What about the Muslim Brotherhood? Well, the Muslim Brotherhood took 3 days to join. Then they had to join when their younger elements moved into this Liberty Square, the Liberty Tahrir, away until the leadership of it followed. Secondly, Muslim Brotherhood is basically a social service which achieved popularity in certain sections, but if you exclude them, you deny the legitimacy of the upheaval and the uprising that took place. And in terms of responsibility, even the most strongest advocates of Islam in their fundamentalist views are definitely impacted by the liberal, democratic, social atmosphere that is emerging in accompanying the upheaval in Egypt. Same thing, there is a fear now that Ghannouchi, not the Prime Minister, the leader who was received, first thing he said, we are not going to ask women to put the hijab on or not, this is not our business. Well, they are beginning to realize that the fear of Islam is being replaced by the impact of liberal democracy on the Muslims, who felt that it was the only anchor for their opposition, and that is why many of them have experienced suffering and discrimination. So now, there's lots of issues. Unfortunately, I think there is now a temporary, I hope a temporary exception between the two countries which are still not amenable for this democratic transformation, and with due apologies to the new neoconservatives, Iraq is not one of them. Is not one of the democratic achievers. Neither is Lebanon, in the real sense of the word. They are sectarian, predicated on a sectarian device. They are pluralistic in their society, unlike what happened in the Tahrir, in the square in Iraq, in Cairo, where the Muslim brothers protected the Copts in their prayers for their martyrs, and the Christian Copts protected the Muslims during their prayers against the Baltajiyya of the Ancien Regime. It's nice now to say Ancien Regime. So, how does this impact? How do we read, is the infection, Tunis infecting or prompting, I mean, expediting the process. Tunis was the last of focus of having a revolution, a transformation. All of a sudden, within 2-3 weeks, Egypt, which is central. And Egypt, yeah, I know some people say, and it's partly wishful thinking and partly reality. This is an Egyptian, not an Arab. Of course, they are afraid to say it's an Arab. Of course, the people, the observers, the experts, the think tanks, no, you don't understand. This has nothing to do with Arabism. This has nothing to do with Jamal Abdel Nasser's legacy. This has nothing to do with Palestine in the real sense of the word. And the proof of the matter is that the army, when it assumed the power of transition, said we are going to maintain our international agreements and our relations with Israel. Maybe. I'm not saying it's not possible. But let me say one thing, because I know a little bit about Egypt. If from now on, let me be very clear and assertive, it's not my wishful thinking. If Israel's impunity for the last 30-40 years in the occupied territories continues, this time Egypt will have imposed a cost on it. It might not break the relationships. It might have the ambassadors remain. But it's not going to be a license for Israel to do what it's doing in the West Bank and Gaza. Impunity is going to be penalized. What kind of penalty it will take, at this moment, I cannot state. But the impunity of Israel, the Egyptian people who are now involved in leading this transfer of power, who are going to be mostly the recipients of the government. The army recognized the legitimacy, and it is now transferring the legality to the repository through a transitional period. Now, when legality and legitimacy blend together, then there is going to be a reassessment. There's going to be an insistence, if the treaty of peace between Egypt and Israel are to take place, We want to know what is the status, and here is the United States plays an important role. What is the status of Israel's presence in the West Bank and Gaza? You would say, occupied. Does Israel acknowledge that it's an occupying power? Isn't settlements a reflection of ownership? Isn't it a reflection of not ownership only, of conquest rather than occupation? And therefore, that kind of avoiding and allowing somebody like Omar Suleiman to manage the relationship with the Palestine Authority was one of the greatest dethronement of reason in dealing with the Palestinian question. And so, when I said that we are at the Palestine Center, Palestine remains center criteria, despite the fact at this moment the internal priorities are there to consolidate what has been achieved by the uprising. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We're going to pass around a microphone so that we can take questions. Just by a show of hand, how many questions do we have now? Okay, I also want to mention at this time for those following the webcast, you could send in your comments at this point and questions, and we'd be happy to direct one or two of those to our panel as well. Again, via Twitter, that's at Palestine Center, and also via Facebook on the webcast page. So why don't you start right back there, Hani, where you're at? Yeah. If you could just keep your questions brief so we could accommodate as many as possible, and let us know who you're directing your question to.
Well, anyone who wants to answer. I think the main central question for Americans is why our foreign policy establishment is so completely incapable of comprehending what's going on. And I think it's methodological. They don't have the analytical tools to understand, just as they didn't understand what happened in Iran 2 years ago. And what we're seeing is a situation of rupture, discontinuity. Understanding what happened 5 minutes ago doesn't help you understand what will happen 5 minutes from now. And this is really the fruition of what Richard Falk 20 years ago called globalization from below. And it's going to spread, and it's spreading to Wisconsin. And it's going to completely undermine
I think
the
we've
corporate
got the question.
authoritarian model of globalization.
Thank you. Anyone want to take a stab at why we failed to see any of this?
Just briefly, look, I mean, if we look at, there were these trends, and I mentioned them. I mean, the youth bulge, the demographics, the change in information, the fact that there was a young generation coming up that just sort of weren't willing to keep playing by the rules that their parents had played by in terms of the relationship between citizens and their governments. But these things are all very sort of, we're all seen as a bit amorphous. And let me just speak of the last couple of years when the current administration came in. They felt that a lot of damage had been done to bilateral relations between the United States and the governments of Muslim majority countries, and they set themselves to that task of improving sort of government to government relations. They returned to, I think, a very traditional conception of diplomacy, and much, and they were much less focused on the peoples of these countries, what the U.S. relationship with them is, or trying to understand what was going on with them. And there were a number of people saying this is anachronistic. You're conducting diplomacy in a way that no longer is effective and no longer works. But it, I think it's taken these events to really bring that up to the surface.
Where's our microphone? Right there, Hani, and then we'll come up here and go across the room.
This is Dua Nakhala from a PhD candidate, University of Texas at Austin. I have two questions. One of them regarding the elections of the Palestinian National Council, and the other is regarding Israel. My question concerning the Palestinian National Council elections, I think one key factor to restoration of the Palestinian unity is the involvement of Hamas in the PLO. My question is, do you see any potentials for Hamas joining the PLO under the current situation? My second question concerning Israel, when the revolution was going on in Egypt, one of the Israeli government spokespersons went on Al Jazeera and said Israel is not interested in a democratic regime in Egypt. My question is, what potential Israeli reactions to a democratic government in Egypt and other Arab countries?
Can I answer that question? And then she can do. First of all, when the PLO was conceived, it was the organization of Palestinian peoplehood. It was to assert an identity for the right of refugees to return, to liberate. It was called the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which meant that it was the framework of Palestinian peoplehood. Of course, Hamas at that time was not present in the early part until 1987 and later on. If the PLO is to be the representative of the Palestinian people, which it ceased to be the representative of all the Palestinian people, then now the advocacy of having to restore Palestinian national unity is that Hamas has to be included in the framework of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. It cannot be an alternative to it, neither can Fatah exclude it. So this is going to be what you might call a catalyst movement within the Palestinian organizational structure, or both would be irrelevant to the necessity, the requirement of a Palestinian national unity. That is the one question. The second question is, of course, Israel considers stability is that situation around it should be stagnated, not stable. And therefore, it uses the term stable, because stability has an attraction, even to the revolutionary, because they want to stabilize after they fulfill their objectives. They want to stabilize. But when stability is mixed with stagnation, then they don't want change. And they have proven that. I mean, and their anxieties at this moment lies more with an Egypt under Sadat and particularly under Mr. Mubarak, where they were selling the gas at 1/3 the price that they were charging the Egyptian people. So, I mean, they were having lots of advantages. They had a calm on their time. They didn't have the need of breaking relations or anything. So stability means stagnation, doesn't mean stability in the usual connotation, especially when it pertains to the Arab region, and especially when it pertains to stability in the perpetuation of the peace treaty as it has been practiced, not as it might have to be changed at a later stage.
Can I just quickly add about the PLO and Hamas? I think what scares me is that Hamas, by the way, as always as part of the negotiations between Hamas and Fatah and the reconciliation, one of Hamas's demands was to reconstitute the PLO and, of course, to bring it and other excluded political forces within the PLO. And Hamas also still pays, at least pays lip service to the Palestinian refugees' right to return, both of those things. And I think what one has to look for is whether, because the people who are on the ground can control, have more power to control what happens than the people who are in exile, and whether Hamas and Fatah will kind of do a deal. at the expense of, if you like, the PLO and the Palestinian refugees. And that, you know, would enable them to stay on, even in a current situation that is not, doesn't bring about freedom not even for the occupied territories. So I think that's what would be worrying.
Can I just add one more point? Because first of all, the veto that was practiced on the issue last week is a culmination of a failed process. Because when President Obama, with the most decent of requests, asked to freeze the settlements for 10 months, you don't freeze settlements. You dismantle them. Because you don't alter the geographic or the demographic character of an occupied territory. Inasmuch as this legal base for there is no negotiations. There is discussions, of course. There is training of police, Palestinian police, drawn from the youth who might be part of a resistance. Yes, you might have technocrats at a revolutionary stage. Yes, but you don't freeze settlements. When he put the bar so low on the Israelis, no negotiations took place. One of the victims of this whole process was, unfortunately, Senator Michele. When you don't acknowledge that this is an occupied territory, under the Fourth Geneva Convention, it becomes almost hopeless. And the best proof of it is not the veto. It's when he asked an extension of 3 months freezing from Israel, and it rejected it. And then still, the United States voted. At least it could have abstained, at least to keep a certain atmosphere of process continuing. That's my observation.
And in the interest of time, we're going to take a few questions together. I wanted to start. I saw hands up here, right here, and then Hanny, can we get the microphone up here, and then we'll come over there as well.
Left side.
Thank you very much. My question touches on what Dr. Maksoud has just mentioned, and it is directed to Dr. Dunne. I was really confused by the explanation that Ambassador Rice said at the UN during the vote. She went on, she voted against the decision, against the request of the PLO. But at the same time, she said, this should not mean that we think the settlements are illegal. I mean, what does that make? Doesn't make sense at all to me. And my point is, do you expect any change after this things quiet down a little bit in the Arab world? I hope they don't, but
I'm going to defer.
Yes.
To
what is the U.S. policy going to be?
I will answer.
And I wanted to keep in mind the editorial in the Washington Post today, which said, Obama is very slow in reacting.
Hanny, let's go to the other side. We had a hand up there for a while.
That was a question.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Very, very interesting panel. I would like to actually ask the question about nonviolence during these last months. I have been so impressed that all of these movements have taken such a nonviolent approach to their revolutions. And I wonder what impact that will have on the Palestinian movements and what impact it will have across the Arab world to witness such change without the protesters taking up arms. Particularly as you look at some references to Mahatma Gandhi and the nonviolence movement, or to Dr. King and the nonviolence movement here, what impact do you think that will have, and will it be sustainable in the future? Thank you.
We go right next to it as well, so we get another question from us that side.
Thank you. I work for a U.S. government body which shall remain nameless, and I'm not speaking on their behalf in this case. I doubt that the U.S. not getting involved in these processes is going to be an option. And I do wonder what it is that we can do in ways that don't fall into the traps that we often fall into, where we're looking for personalized leadership, where we're trying to manipulate local politics and we end up not doing a very good job of it, where we have our old fears of Muslims that we still have to overcome. What are things that we can do that would do the most help and cause the least amount of harm? And in what sense is doing nothing a useful option?
Thank you. So we've got three different questions. Anyone would like to begin?
I could start quickly with the question on nonviolence, which is a very good question on how how it will impact. And I think one of the things that I find somewhat frustrating is the myth that Palestinians resort to violence, because the Palestinians have had several non-violent uprisings in their history, including 1936 to 1939, and including the first Intifada, which for about 4 or 5 years was an almost completely non-violent uprising that had a huge impact on public opinion around the world. But unfortunately, the PLO did not know how to translate into political power. However, I do think that now seeing how nonviolence can lead to tangible results will give an additional push, let's say within the Palestinian context, to 2 ongoing nonviolent struggles. One is the struggle against the wall, which has been underway for about 5 or 6 years now, in which every day people are paying a heavy price to go protest against their lands being confiscated, as well as the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which is a very, very good non-violent tool. And I think that will spread in the other countries. Just very quickly on your question of what should the U.S. do, I like the option of doing nothing, actually. I mean, I think that would be a good, healthy approach. And there's nothing to stop the U.S., instead of treating the region as its to control, or seeing the resources as basically its to manage, to treat the Arab countries as though they were Britain or France, you know, or sovereign nations. Nobody's going to stop selling oil, they need to. But as sovereign nations that interact, you know, with sovereign nations, I think the days of trying to, well, I don't think they're over, sadly, but you know, they should be over, and the sooner the better.
Okay, let's see. Just briefly on these 3 questions. Look, on the veto at the UN Security Council, you know, I think clearly, first of all, I think President Obama had wanted not to use the veto at the UN Security Council at all during his presidency, right? There's been this renewed emphasis on multilateralism and so forth. So, you know, clearly they did it reluctantly in a way, but I think what it was, I mean, it was many years of past practice and intense pressure from the Congress and so forth, and coming in the midst of the rest of this crisis and so forth. So they did what they did. Regarding the use of nonviolence and the impact on the region, you know, of course, we're going to have to see in a way how successful, you know, what's the ultimate outcome? How do these situations look? They started out non-violently and in a very, at least in Tunisia and Egypt, in a rather inspiring way. What's the outcome going to be a few years down the road? I mean, I think at the moment it's notable that Al-Qaeda has been pretty quiet, because this is not their model of change in the region, right? I mean, you know, that people could bring about, you know, nonviolent change. And so, you know, if it succeeds in bringing about democratic governments that people are reasonably satisfied with or whatever, I think it will be very, very important model. Regarding what the United States can do, I'm going to differ with you a little bit, Nadia, because I think that, first of all, we're going to have these new governments are already asking for assistance from the United States specifically. So what are we going to do? Say no? I mean, you know, especially a country like Egypt, a former major ally and aid recipient and so forth, and they say, now we're making a transition to democracy, please help us, we're going to say, well, no, not anymore. I mean, I don't think that's really an option. I do think, though, that in the assistance, I think, for example, in the assistance package to Egypt, I think needs to be completely rethought. The balance in that assistance, $1.3 billion military, $250 million economic, I think is inappropriate in this new era and needs to be completely revisited. I think in the kind of assistance that the United States offers in these cases, we should do what we can, understanding we're outsiders, and understanding there will also be others, Europeans particularly, that will be involved to contribute to the development of systems in these countries, democratic systems, and to stay a little distant from the outcomes. I mean, I do agree that we shouldn't be, trying to pick winners and that kind of thing.
Nonviolence. There's no question. I mean, I lived in India for 6 years, and nonviolence should be the means of resistance. Resistance through demonstrations, through appeal to conscience of the world, through diplomatic appeal to the United Nations, through all these should be exhausted as priority. And that distinguishes resistance from terrorism. But it doesn't mean dropping the option of militancy, because it allows those who are violently denying rights that this becomes passivity and not peaceful resistance. Resistance involves all the options as first options, and militancy as the last option. That's where Hamas made a mistake, because that transfers resistance to revenge, and that's where the Fatah, the Palestinian Authority, dropped resistance as an option in order to give way for the peaceful negotiations. The second thing, what can America do at this moment? Well, it can't do much. Let me say why. It is committed to strategic superiority, and also now with the F-35 going to Israel, it's committed to the strategic as a constant of its relationship with the region as a whole. Would this new revolutionary development in the Arab world accept that around 280 million people, equal to around 25-30 million Israelis approximately, not 20, how much are they?
About
Seven. 7 million, to have strategic superiority over the entirety of the Arab world? I don't think that is going to be sustainable. It can be enforced, but it can't be sustainable as an enforcement measure. The second thing is that President Obama has many priorities. This is a temporary priority, what is taking place. His priority is the internal priorities of finance, economics, social security, health insurance, and he has a Congress which, when AIPAC goes with a letter to the congressman, they immediately sign. So we had the latest thing is that around 329 congressmen saying that he's, because of his asking for freezing, that he's exercising undue pressure on our only ally and the only democracy in the region. That has to be revised. Now, how he has to calculate the paralysis that they can inflict on his other agenda, and politically, because apparently Israel has become, willy-nilly, a political factor in the United States policy making towards the area. Nobody is saying abandon Israel. Nobody's saying don't help them. But if it's going to be on the basis of continued strategic superiority over the Palestinians and over the Arab world in general, it's going to be included when legitimacy becomes legal. It's going to be included in many revision of Egyptian policy and even Tunis, which is a little bit distant, and others. So if I have any kind of appeal to the senators, and which I did in 1986 when they signed something about, they went, at that time Senator Biden, whom I visited when I was in Beirut, he came and we had a luncheon, and we came relatively friendly, not friends, friendly. He invited me for breakfast and with some of his colleagues, 4 or 5 senators, and some. He said, "What do you want us to do?" I said, "Nothing. We, the Arabs, are a gullible people. Just give us the impression that you're reading what you're signing." And I left. Since then, he was very upset with me. He considered that. So, in a sense, what I'm really pleading is that the constituency of conscience, which elected Obama, and now is widespread in the United States, to explain, to counteract the notion of strategic superiority, and to extract from Israel, they have the influence to do it, to extract from Israel that you are an occupying power. Because Israel does not define, it used to be until 76, the United States treated it as occupied. Now they might say occupied, but they never treat it as such. They don't deal with Israel as an occupied. Because if it doesn't admit that it's an occupying power, I tell you, the peace process is a process without peace. Like the road map is a road without map. Okay, thank you.
We're over on time. Thank you all very much.